Today is kind of a prequel, I guess, kind of at the same time as the gibbeting, looking at some of the other things that are happening at the same time and some of the other things that lead to the need for the Anatomy Act that also ends gibbeting. So that kind of 1820s period where there is massive demand for bodies. And as I've said before, I believe it's starts off with the Murder Act of 1752, which says that all murderers should not get the privilege of being buried. So they are either going to be dissected or they're going to be gibbeted. And sometimes you might also do that to some other crimes, but those ones you had to do it. But not all executions automatically have those things happen. So for instance, what's his name? Highwayman Jim O'Neill is hanged in 1816, and his corpse is taken away after the execution by his friends and family and given a jolly good wake at the nearest pub. This must have really frustrated all the anatomists who would have wanted to get hold of more corpses, given how infrequently they got them. Some of the ones get gibbeted, some of them get waked. Only a few of them make it through to the anatomists. Occasionally they do. Charles Smith in 1816 is an Irishman who has, with an accomplice, gone and burgled a pottery in the Ousburn. And that they've happened to have startled the caretaker. And they bundle him up, put a bag over his head and beat him a lot. He survives a little while though, and he says he recognises Charles Smith by his voice. Doesn't know the other guy, so the other guy is never caught. Recognises Charles Smith by his voice. And that's enough to get a conviction. The case is delayed for about a year, and this is probably because the judges have some query about taking the evidence as the sort of the sole thing on the basis of someone who's just had a really nasty hit to the head, and how much can he really remember about anything. Nonetheless, December the following year, he gets executed. To the last, he's protesting his innocence. His last words, his last dying speech survives, and it is a lovely mixture of confessing to all his previous sins and that, you know, he has not necessarily been a good man, but he's actually innocent of this particular crime. And yeah, he's dissected, and normally that would be an end to it. But the particular weird thing that happens with Charles Smith is a year later in the Durham County Advertiser, an advert appears that says, "An eminent collector and antiquarian of Newcastle is possessed of a piece of the skin of the late Charles Smith, executed near that town last year for the murder of Charles Stewart, which he has tanned and dressed for the purpose of binding a large paper copy of the murderer's dying speech." Now, this thing of tanning the skins of executed criminals, this isn't a unique one by any means. There are only a handful in this country. It is not a common thing either, and this is the only northeastern one as far as I'm aware. And that thing probably survives, because this antiquarian of Newcastle is almost certainly a chap called John Bell, and the John Bell collection has made its way into the Newcastle libraries. And in Newcastle Library there is a set of ephemera relating to this case, including copies of his dying words, his last speech, and one piece of suspiciously leathery, thick substance that's clearly not paper. So, as far as I'm aware, nobody's ever actually had it tested, but there's a good chance that Newcastle Libraries has in it a piece of the skin of Charles Smith. There you go. But this is rare, and the demand is continuing to rise. More and more surgeons are needed. The population's rising, and also there have been a lot of wars lately, and these continue, and the army and the navy are constantly wanting more surgeons, and it's very difficult to train them up. To become a proper surgeon, you can go to a university, and the closest of those is going up to Edinburgh, or you can do it locally at this point. You can shadow another surgeon for 7 years, probably, along with doing various stints shadowing people in hospital to get the necessary experience. But how do you get the experience of actually cutting up a body? You can't do it on live patients, really. You can't be the person who's doing test cases of things. Remember, this is pre-anaesthetics, so if you're not going to want to have somebody who doesn't know what they're doing any sort of operation on you, the only things that an apprentice surgeon was even allowed to do was bloodletting and a couple of very minor, very non-invasive surgical techniques, and even then only if their boss, their master, said they could. So they're not going to pick up the experience that way, and this demand is growing for another way to do it. And a big debate is starting nationally about how to deal with this. We can see this in the early editions of the Newcastle magazine, which starts in 1823. And even in the early editions, there is a debate going on about where do we get enough corpses. So you start off in the Newcastle magazine with a chap called Blancardus, who says that, first of all, you need to punish any surgeon who gets hold of a body and then wastes it, rather than using it for full dissection teaching purposes. There are people at this time who, once they've got a corpse, will, for instance, do experiments with electricity on it. This is the first era of Frankenstein experiments. This is very soon after the writing of Frankenstein, and yeah, that kind of experimentation rather than teaching. He thinks that should not be allowed. He also says that the easiest group of people we can take is anyone who kills themselves, should be fair game for the dissectionists. Very controversial one, that. And he also suggests that anyone who has been guilty of a very serious but non-capital crime should also be dissected when they die, unless they complete a certain number of years of good behaviour afterwards. If they complete a number of years, then that's sort of their term is done. It's fine. But if they die before that's up, then they need to do a bit more for society, and they can hand over their bodies. A response came to Blancardus from WNF. They do like not saying who they are in these newspapers. And WNF finds the whole thing just beyond the pale. He's heard horror stories about what happens with cadavers up in Edinburgh. And he says it's not the job of the public and it's not the job of the government to provide corpses, which is kind of the problem, as we'll see later. A lot of the surgeons are finding that when the government doesn't provide corpses, they're going to have to find their own. So not really a solution there. Then someone called HS chimes in and says that he understands this annoyance, but he says it's important to keep a sense of moral indignation, or else everybody will take up grave robbing as a hobby to make some more money. So it's good that people don't like the idea. We can see a little bit about one way round it that people have found by looking at some of the remaining corpses that were on hospital grounds. So in the late 90s, when they were building the Centre for Life in Newcastle, that site is on top of the old Newcastle Infirmary, the one that predates the Royal Victoria Infirmary. And it was in situ from the mid-18th century through to the end of the 19th. And in that time, it had its own graveyard. And there's a period of about 80 years just before the Anatomy Act, most of it, where there's hundreds of bodies been buried there. And they had to dig those up in the process of getting the place ready for the Centre for Life. Now, I've heard some horror stories about some of those bones being not entirely decomposed, let us say. But the point we want to look at here is that some of them are not entirely complete, and some of them have some marks you wouldn't necessarily expect. Because if you have to train at that time to become a surgeon, the best source of dead bodies you've got is people who've recently died in the infirmary and who are going to be buried on the site. So who's going to know what you've done with them in the meantime? Around a third of those who die in the hospital are left in the hospital, and about 600 of them have been found on this site. You can't be precise because some of them are in bits. And almost 15% of those have had a craniotomy. Now, there is no way that 15% of those people needed a craniotomy as part of any of their treatment, or were involved in an important, like a post-mortem, where that was a part of the process of working out how they died. So the rest of them clearly have had craniotomies as part of their completely illegal training dissection. Similarly, you can find quite a few bones with various practice amputation marks. You can see a few of them have got sort of cutting marks at different angles through the bone, like the apprentice is learning how to cut and learning which angle is the best cut and which tool is the best tool to use to get through the bone. one body appears to have been sawed in half, and then the coffin contains half a person and then a rock to make up the rest of the weight, so that presumably during the burial nobody noticed that only half the person was actually there. Another one contains just a jumble of body parts. It's really quite unpleasant. And that's just the ones that we can see, of course. Your average dissection isn't necessarily going to need you to leave marks on the bones. So from the number we've got of that might lead one to think that actually quite a high proportion of the people who were not claimed by a relative would have just been surreptitiously snuck into the back room for a little bit of, giving their body to medical science, whether they wanted to or not. These people, of course, would not have chosen this as their resting place. There are a minority of people, who actually think they quite like to have one of these things done to them. Some of them are people involved in the medical profession one way or another. There's a chap who's a maker of surgical implements who, when he dies, gives his body to medical science, saying that I have gained my livelihood from you all these years. It's only right that you should now have my body to look at after I'm dead. Some of the surgeons themselves were not averse to this. I guess they'd lost any sense of squeamishness about it, perhaps. Thomas Wright was an apprentice in the 1820s who wrote a diary of his experiences as an apprentice barber surgeon in Newcastle. And he says, I need to get the quote out for this, he says, "I have no notion of being devoured by reptiles when I and my body quarrel, and feel inclined to follow the example of the late professionally patriotic gentleman who bequeathed his corpse to the useful to others. Only I shall make a further proviso, viz. That I shall be injected and properly prepared so as to cut a figure amongst the rest of my companions on a lecture room table or in an anatomical museum. I can indeed contemplate with perfect satisfaction the idea of being stuck in a glass case, the terror of young ladies and little boys, the admiration and study of professors, and being at any rate able then to contribute to the good of society whatever advantages I may have had been to it during life." This is sadly too long a digression. My chapter is not on patriotism. So he thinks it's an act of patriotism to give his body to medical science, in effect. Only what he wants isn't so much to be chopped up as to be put on display in his anatomised form. This, of course, is not a widely held opinion at that time. There are exceptions. Yes, Jeremy Bentham, of course, volunteers to be dissected, completely displayed, preserved, and attend all continuing meals of his university college. But most people aren't really in for that. This is a problem, because medical schools really want to be able to offer a wide range. They want to be able to say that they can teach in the Paris manner, which is to say they want to be able to offer one corpse per trainee. And in Edinburgh, they do actually start saying they can do that, although they do then, as a little caveat at a later point, say, yes, you are responsible for providing your own bodies for that bit, by the way. Sorry about that. Newcastle doesn't get quite as much as that. The homegrown market is not nearly as big as the Edinburgh Anatomy School. But we are on the main route from London to Edinburgh, and also a kind of filter from the entirety of Yorkshire up to Edinburgh. It's the main way of getting to Edinburgh. And that makes it the obvious route for certain suspicious parcels. All it takes is a crate. Some of them are labelled with things like glass, handle with care, or this way up. That does happen. They could be full body sized, or if you really want to try and disguise what is in your package all the way that is going up to Edinburgh, you can put it in a smaller box. Some of them are as little as 2 foot square, with somebody really kind of squished in there. Fortunately, we don't get anything quite as bad here as what happened in Liverpool, where there is a quite staggering story. In 1826, there are soldiers unpacking barrels of what are labelled as bitter salts, and discover one of them, I think one of the barrels breaks and his hand goes in by mistake, and he discovers that what is in there is not in fact bitter salts, it's body parts. And all in all, they found that 33 bodies had been packed into all of this, and they'd already made their way from Dublin to Liverpool to the docks, and had been unloaded and were about to be put on a cart to travel again into Scotland, presumably Edinburgh. In Newcastle, the main site for this is a place called the Turk's Head. The Turk's Head and Collingwood Street, which is kind of where Lloyd's Bank is now, was the commonest drop-off point and pick-up point for the mail coach as it went through on its way north to Edinburgh. And for instance, in September 1825, so 10:30 in the evening, the staff of the coach office are left a trunk, travelling trunk. Instructions to send it on to James Syme, or Sim, Esquire, in Edinburgh. And that chap is an anatomy lecturer, and he's a rival to the more famous Dr Knox. So that might have got them suspicious even at the start, but he might have wanted anything. So it is accidentally left on the south-going pile instead of the north-going pile. And at that time of the day, there isn't another south-going coach, so it doesn't get put on anything. It gets left. And there isn't a northbound Sunday service. So it gets left for the whole of Saturday afternoon and the whole of Sunday. And then on Monday morning, as the newspaper describes it, a most nauseous smell was smelt from an oozing liquid therefrom. It was immediately suspected to contain a subject, and subject is in italics in the paper, so we know what they're getting at. The trunk is opened on magistrate's orders, and it's found to contain the remains of a fair-haired young lady with no marks of violence on her. And she is swiftly buried in a pauper's grave on Ballast Hills in Ousburn, which is where nonconformists and paupers tend to go if nobody knows where they should be put, basically. Some of Ballast Hills Cemetery is still there. There are very few standing gravestones, but there's a sort of a path made out of gravestones that you can walk along. Not the best of places to put her, as we will discover in a bit. This was not an isolated incident. The Turf's Head staff were presumably on the lookout for this. They knew that this was a thing that was happening. In January 1826, there were 3 separate incidents. Obviously, it makes more sense to do this in December and January because of the cold weather. It helps stop the bodies from giving themselves away for a longer period of time. And another one just a month later, of a man of over 6 foot tall, which was tall enough that it was probably a little bit unusual at that time, was found in a coach from Leeds. The box weighed over 16 stone, which again might have given them some hint of what was going on. This one, they actually put a detailed description of the body in the press in Leeds, and somebody was able to come forward and say, yeah, that's my father. We've been to the site of his grave and he's been dug up. So he was able to be sent back, actually, and put back in his correct burial spot. In November 1828, the porters in the inn get another long package on the way from York to Edinburgh. In this case, they just refused to handle it and sent it back to York, saying, yeah, we're not taking that any further, mate. Unfortunately, the York porters in this story also said, yeah, nothing to do with us, thanks, and sent it back to Newcastle again. Of course, by the time it's done it several times, it's not going to be in its best state. And the story goes at this point that they just chucked it in the river without even opening it, although that is unconfirmed. Other stories say it ended up in St John's graveyard. There was another one at about the same time. Scotsman James Aitchison brought a trunk to the Turf's Head, which rather quickly attracted suspicion. It was opened and Aitchison was actually arrested on the spot. And he said that he'd just been paid to deliver the chest. And he was acquitted in court because nobody could prove he had done any more than just deliver the chest for somebody else, which the jurors might have regretted when the following day after the trial, they found out a witness came forward saying that they had seen him himself buying the wood that the trunk was made of. So he wasn't just doing it for somebody else. And so it continues. Christmas Day 1828, a child's corpse is found that had been buried in York only the day before. A couple of weeks after that, a Scotsman hands in a trunk that is found to contain the body of Lizzie Mills, who had been buried on Ballast Hills only the day before again. And the thing about Ballast Hills by this point is where they're putting these bodies where they find them, but it's also where some of the bodies are coming from. So what's going on there? The thing about Ballast Hills is it is way too full. It is incredibly overcrowded. In the space of 5 years, in the early 1820s, over 3,500 people had been buried in what is really quite a small patch of ground. When its replacement is opened in the opening speeches, they say that the previous one at Ballast Hills had been literally crowded with the dead, and there were pigs rootling around amongst it, making it even less pleasant. Some of these bodies, of course, that were on their journey didn't even make it as far as Newcastle. They were found earlier on in various places in Yorkshire. There's one nice one. There's a lady found in a mail coach on its way through Beverley, which is actually going up the other way. It's going up via Carlisle, where they actually identify one of the people who's involved. A barman identifies the person who's handed the package in as being a regular in the area, known as Edinburgh Bill, which again is a bit of a clue. And the incriminating goods upon this gentleman include a rather large section of a young lady's hair, which he's obviously keeping for himself as a memento, and a letter which advises him to send all packages via Carlisle because the route from Newcastle has started being too much watched. By 1828, it's clear that anything that goes up through Newcastle, those people at the inn, Turk's Head Inn, are checking the boxes too carefully. We're going to have to go via Carlisle instead. It's really hard to know how much of this grave robbing is actually going on. One historian who's looked at it in detail reckons that it's several thousand a year, but that's about as good as we can get. The select committee that was supposed to be looking into it in 1828 said that they knew in that year of 592 bodies dissected, of which less than a tenth had come from legal sources. But it was kind of an open secret because you couldn't just go and complain about that. You couldn't say to the surgeon, where did you get that body from? It's clearly illegal, you having it. Because, of course, body snatching itself isn't technically illegal at that date. Because a corpse isn't anybody's property. And if something isn't property, you can't steal it. There you go. They obviously changed that law later, but that's the way it is at this point. You're more likely to get into more trouble if you've actually taken any grave goods, like valuable clothing. Taking the valuable clothing from the grave is actually a much worse crime than taking the body. And generally, if a resurrectionist is caught, they're probably just going to end up with a whipping. And unless it's really blatant, it might be that nothing bad happens to them at all. So that encourages this. And in London, there are gangs who make their entire money out of doing this. One of them, a diary survives, which has, very detailed which graveyards we went into at which point, which bodies, which age, and how much we got for them from which person who's sending them on to different places. So there's a big business here, actually. And that leads instead to the idea that maybe you could protect yourself. And there are some places in the northeast, not many, but some, where you can see evidence of people who are worried about what is going to happen to them, and they are dealing with it by trying to protect their own corpses. In 1831, the medieval church in Morpeth, which of course is also right next to that road that runs up towards Edinburgh, which is the spot where grave robbers are most likely to, efficiently get their bodies. They get a new building on the other side from the church itself, which is a watch house. And every night somebody would stay in that watch house to keep away the grave robbers. Belford gets a watch house, also in Northumbria, and extends its own walls. Just over the border in Eyemouth, just north of Northumberland, there's a really interesting watch house, which you can Google pictures of it. It's made out of gravestones that are no longer in use, so it's really macabre to look at and rather nice. It's been suggested the railings around All Saints in Newcastle might have that purpose. They're from about the right date. Other people say that the ditch around the graveyard of the Holy Trinity Church in Sunderland, which was put there in 1824, was there for the same reason. Again, it's about the right date for that to at least be a consideration. Ballast Hills was replaced by Westgate Hill General Cemetery. And when you look at the documentation for Westgate Hill, it says, among other things, we wanted a place so defended by walls or other methods of security that it should be next to impossible for the robbers of the grave to accomplish their inhuman purposes. Such a place, my friends, it is expected that the Westgate Hill General Cemetery will shortly be. And that's clearly a big draw, you know, get yourself sorted out to end up here, because we will keep you safe from that possibility. The one thing we don't seem to have done, almost surprisingly actually, in the area is go down the mortsafe route, which is something that Scots do quite a lot, which is the building of sort of cages, iron cages, over where your body is, to make it harder physically to dig up that body. There are a couple of examples in the northeast. There are some in St Michael's in Warden, which is near Hexham, from a surprisingly late date actually. They're from a point where you'd think you wouldn't have to worry about this anymore. And there is one from 1815 in Holystone, which is just up past Rothbury. Again, you've either got Scots people or people who are particularly paranoid, or people who have reason to think that their corpse might be of particular interest, possibly. Hard to say. And then finally, of course, if you're one of these people who's desperately trying to get hold of corpses, there is a more immediate way of doing it. This is the era of Burke and Hare. This is the era of cutting out the middleman and just providing a corpse. Now, they operate in Edinburgh and they sell the corpses that they've created in Edinburgh, and there is no direct evidence of that happening in the northeast of England. There are a few connections to Burke and Hare. Certainly the Newcastle papers were very interested, and the Newcastle public was very interested. When Burke was hanged, the Newcastle Current reports the scene in great detail. There are alleged connections. There's a connection that the two of them were in Sunderland for a bit before they went up to Edinburgh. There's a story of, you know, one of them ending up back in the area afterwards. But the more you look at it, the harder it is to pin down any real evidence for any of those stories. I've not managed yet to do that. There is a weird little coda which involves a chap called John Margetts, who is a North Shields barber surgeon's apprentice who disappears in 1827, and some people thought had been burked, because burking does become a verb at that point, and they think that he's been done away with for that reason, and there are petitions to central government on the subject and pamphlets and so on, but again, nothing actually comes of it. But to return back to almost the beginning, we do have one little connection with that area, which is our friend Thomas Wright again, who came to this area in 1826. Before that, he had been an apprentice in Edinburgh, and he had taken anatomy classes with Dr Robert Knox, who is the main gentleman that Burke and Hare were selling to. So that was a couple of years earlier. They didn't necessarily quite overlap, but they might just about overlap. Certainly, he was in an atmosphere where he knew perfectly well that the bodies were being taken from their graves, and he would also have known that very recently, previously, some of the bodies would have been just bashed over the head. It's a real shame he doesn't talk about it more in his diaries, really, because he would be a fascinating person to ask about that. In fact, he actually writes a letter about Knox a couple of years later, and he says that the process was standard, that students were expected to provide their own corpses, and that you put a rope around the neck to pull the corpse from the grave, and deliberately disfigure the face to prevent identification. He doesn't admit that he's ever done this, of course, but he says this is, common knowledge that this is the done thing. And he's sort of preparing the defence for Dr Knox. He says that there is no way that Knox could have known that Burke and Hare had been doing anything other than grave robbing. He's defending his old master. But it comes to something when the best defence that you weren't involved in burking was, well, yes, everybody's grave robbing around here. All the students are doing it. That's where we get all the corpses from. But that pretty much does seem to be the situation. You were either prepared to do that, or you would have to use all of those people that died in the infirmary and nobody came to pick them up, and therefore they were considered fair game, or a mixture of both. So that is how things were up until 1832, when they say, no, we're just going to take the bodies of all unclaimed paupers, which of course leads to its own complete set of problems and various riots all the way around the country. But it does at least solve some problems of the time. So on that note, I shall leave you to contemplate what you want doing with your body when you are no longer using it. Good night, all.